Welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Deborah Silameo, a member of the Board of Governors of the National Press Club and a communications strategist focused on social good. So I am just delighted to welcome Bill Novelli, who is one of the most innovative and respected communications and advocacy leaders of our time, as our headliner today. He's here to talk about his new book, Good Business, the talk, fight, win way to change the world. And it seems today we really need both good business and change in the world. So good afternoon, Bill, and welcome to the National Press Club.
Thank you, Deborah.
You're welcome. Before I formally introduce you, I just want to remind our viewers that we welcome your questions. We want this to be a dialogue. And you can submit questions by emailing headliners@press.org. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Bill Novelli's professional journey began in the Mad Men days of advertising. But as he tells it, it wasn't very fulfilling until he had a chance to work on the Sesame Street account and realized that he wanted to put his skills to work for a greater cause and moved to the Peace Corps. It wasn't too long before he and a Peace Corps colleague co-founded Porter Novelli, a firm that helped pioneer social marketing, or the marketing of ideas and behaviors rather than products. The firm became renowned nationally and globally, and Bill is often named as one of the most influential PR professionals. He went on to lead social good organizations such as CARE, the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, and AARP. He was so effective that one column in Fortune magazine was headlined, "What Bill Novelli wants, Bill Novelli gets." You could retire after that, right? But no, Bill founded and leads the Business for Social Impact Center at George Washington University, where he is training the next generation of socially responsible business leaders. And he's still working on aging issues, leading the Coalition to Transform Advanced Care to change the way we deal with advanced illness and end-of-life issues. So it seems that for Bill Novelli, the question is never, when are you going to retire, but what's next? Bill, welcome to the National Press Club.
Thank you so much, Deborah. It's a pleasure to be with you.
We are so delighted to have you here today. Let me just ask you about the title of your book, first of all, The Talk, Fight, Win Way to Change the World. What do you mean by good business, and what do you mean by talk, fit, fight, and win?
Well, as you described, I've had a long career. And one of the things I've learned is that today's big, tough social and environmental issues are way too big for any sector to solve alone. We need everybody at the table. There are no permanent opponents in my book, only permanent values and permanent principles. So Tuesday's opponent can be Thursday's ally. And I've talked and fought with lots of different sectors and lots of different organizations, the tobacco industry for one, the pharmaceutical industry, and many others. And my thought is that if we can get everybody at the table, the nonprofit sector, government, corporate, everybody, that we can really move towards solving these problems. And sometimes we talk too much, sometimes we fight too much, but more often than not, if we do that, we can win.
Well, that actually brings me to a very topical subject that I wanted to ask you about, talking about fighting. You're a leader in public healthcare initiatives, and I want to talk for a minute about the COVID effort and the COVID vaccine effort. Instead of becoming a moment of national unity against a deadly disease, COVID became a political issue, and wearing a mask a matter of politics and not science. This division is continuing with the vaccination effort, and we really do need to get people vaccinated and get a critical number vaccinated. How would you suggest we approach this from a communications and marketing perspective to try to move forward to get people to practice safe behaviors and to get vaccinated?
We have managed to politicize just about everything. I mean, who would have ever dreamed we could politicize a pandemic? And as you say, masks and social distancing and even vaccinations. And there are a lot of people who are resisting getting vaccinated. Many of them are low-income people, healthcare workers, nursing home workers, people like this. And actually, when you look at the background, some of them have good reason to feel suspicious. For example, African Americans, they go all the way back to Tuskegee and those famous syphilis experiments. And there's good evidence today to show that people of color oftentimes don't get the same healthcare treatment that everybody else gets. They get less pain management, they get less palliative care, and so on and so forth. And then when you add to that all the misinformation out there today in social media, we can understand why they feel this suspicion. And we've got to overcome it. We really have to overcome it. One thing I feel that the evidence shows us is that fear is not going to work. You can't scare somebody into getting vaccinated. What we've got to do is we've got to focus on the benefits, efficacy. In other words, if you do this, here's what will happen that will be good for you and your family and your peers. And one of the most important things, I think, Deborah, and I think you've seen this, is that the messenger can be as important as the message. So we've got to get the messengers right. And who are they? Are they athletes? Are they celebrities? Are they people next door? We've really got to do the research to understand that.
I know you've spent a lot of time working with political leaders on the Hill in various administrations. And it seems like we're really dug in now. We're so divided. Do you see a way for us to work our way out of it, to solve this problem together?
We are a house divided. You're absolutely right. And we see it every day. I am an optimist, and my thoughts are these. Number one, I think we have to realize that this mess we're in is cyclical. This isn't the first time in our American history that this has happened. We've had tough times before. We've been isolationist, we've been anti-immigrant. We've had these fights in our history. Number two, we really do need leadership. We need leadership to stand up and make a difference. There's no question about that. But number three, I think it comes down to us, to you and to me and all the people listening in today. We've got to cross the aisle, and you know what that means. When a politician goes to the other side to talk to the opposition to try to make something work. We need to do that as individuals. So, in my family, I have close members of my family with whom I can't discuss politics. We all have that, I think, to a certain degree. We've got to cross the aisle in our churches and synagogues, our workplaces, and in our families. And we've got to try to find common ground. And, the other day I had a talk with a member of my family, I won't say who, and we couldn't even agree on, the storming of the Capitol. But what we could agree on was climate change. So we said, okay, let's talk about that.
Okay. Well, that kind of brings me to the other part of the equation. It's not just the politics, it's the businesses. And, you talk about how important it is to get them at the table. They're a little bit all over the place right now with this sort of thing, although I did see that there were several companies saying, like Budweiser, they weren't going to put their money into a lot of ads on the Super Bowl. They were going to fund the Ad Council's COVID vaccination campaign. So just, both what you teach your students, but also advice for all of us. How can we as business or, nonprofit leaders or consumers help bring the business community along?
I think there we have some real positive trends going on. I think businesses are figuring out that they can create more financial value for their stockholders by doing what you and I work on, which is to create social value, environmental value for their customers, their employees, their suppliers, the communities where they work. I call it doing well by doing good. And I spent a lot of time in Good Business, the book, talking about that.
Mhm.
And there are many examples of this. And when they can do that, when they can both, create financial value and social value, that's the sweet spot. They've really hit the sweet spot. And I think the trend is a positive one. I'm not saying that every business is figuring it out, but I think a lot of them are.
Anybody you'd like to sort of applaud for that?
Well, I'll give a few examples. One of the companies I work with is the VF Corporation. So they have a bunch of brands like Vans and the North Face and Timberland, and VF handles the supply chain. And about 90% of the employees who make the footwear and the apparel that they sell are women. They're not employees of VF itself, they're contract employees.
Mhm.
And VF says to itself, okay, we want to help these women. And so they do surveys to find out what these women need. They might need childcare, clean water, eyeglasses. Oftentimes they say, we need some protection against sexual harassment on the job. Now, VF says this is the right thing to do, but at the same time, they know that the millennials, who are key consumers for them, want to know that the people who make these products are being treated fairly. So you have a combination here of enlightened self-interest and good business.
And I guess now we have more information about how they're sourcing their products, how they're treating their workers than we used to have.
Yeah, now that brings up transparency. You know, it's harder to get away with what people did years ago. So we have more whistleblowers, lots of things go on so that, you can't really hide the truth. It's going to come out one way or another.
Let's go back to some of the stories that you tell in your book. One of the great big issues you worked on was fighting the tobacco wars, trying to get tobacco regulated, trying to prevent kids from getting hooked on nicotine, with the campaign for tobacco-free kids, which you founded and ran. And you said then the problem was both that money and nicotine are addictive, I guess equally addictive. Can you take us a little bit behind the scenes, tell us your David and Goliath tale there and what lessons you learned from that fight?
Well, it was David and Goliath. And obviously the tobacco industry was Goliath. This was back in the day, and it honestly hasn't completely changed. This is back in the day when they had so many PR agencies signed up. They had so many ad agencies on their roster. They gave so much money to Congress. They worked at state capitals. The tobacco industry was really formidable. But in addition to that, corporate America embraced the tobacco industry. It was just another industry. So how do you fight against that? What can we do? We had a few things going for us. Parents really disliked tobacco, and they disliked the tobacco industry. And we could play on that. And one of the great things that happened was something called the Truth Initiative.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea here is who can we get mad at? Kids like to rebel. They rebel against their mothers, their teachers, their coaches, everybody. Why don't we get the kids to get mad at the tobacco industry? Those are the people who are hooking them and getting these kids as replacement smokers. So that was a big step forward. And it took a long time to develop all the strategies that worked. Banning smoking in public places. You remember when you got on an airplane and people were smoking? People were smoking in classrooms. One of my clients at Porto Novelli was the National Cancer Institute. And one of their executives was in a meeting and she held up a cigarette and she was smoking it. And she said, we've got to do something about tobacco in America. So that's the way it was. And now we've come a long way. We've got smoking down among kids and adults, but here comes vaping. So we can never let down our guard.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to ask you. I mean, it's like it never ends. you've got the flavored e-cigarettes, the vaping. So I guess you still worry about it.
Oh, I do, and I work on it. Today, I chair the campaign for Tobacco Free Kids Board, and we're spending a lot of our time now working internationally. Because if you look abroad, the tobacco industry is doing the same things there that they did here 25 and 35 years ago.
Another thing that you mentioned in talking about the tobacco wars was the difference between marketing pleasure and marketing safety. And I'm wondering, beyond tobacco, what are the takeaways for nonprofit leaders today when they're trying to get people to do the right thing?
Well, of course, tobacco is unique. It's an addictive product. So a lot of that pleasure comes from nicotine addiction. And there's an old saying in the tobacco wars, whoever controls nicotine will win the war. And FDA today controls nicotine, so we'll see if we can win this war completely. But when it comes to other kinds of behaviors, let's take, for example, exercise. We have to say to ourselves, where's the pleasure and where's the pain? What's the price of encouraging people to exercise? We know what the price can be. You have to join a gym, you have to buy equipment. There's the price of sweating and the pain of exercise. And then what's the pleasure? And the idea for so many programs, whether it's dieting and nutrition, whether it's exercise, whatever it may be, is to try to balance that out and to make the benefits outweigh the risks and the price.
To make it somehow pleasurable.
Well, if not pleasurable, at least tolerable.
We have a question about climate change issues. What do you say to activists, especially in the climate change community, who think that the business and private sector is the problem? How do you convince them that the private sector and capitalism in general is part of the solution?
Well, that brings us back to talking and fighting, right? So I'm working on climate change right now. I co-chair the advisory board of something called the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health. And one of the things we're trying to do really is get the word out and take advantage of what's happening today, which is more and more public opinion is turning towards understanding climate change and the need for climate action. So and I know that you need public opinion behind you to really change policy. And policy is so important. I've talked to a number of the oil and gas companies. And I think that they are very pragmatic about this. And they see the writing on the wall. And they understand that they basically have to make changes. And we've all seen General Motors come out in the last couple of days saying, we're going to electric cars. So the oil and gas industry sees this, and they basically want to create change. But it can't happen overnight. I used to have an executive from ExxonMobil come to my Georgetown University corporate social responsibility class, and he would put up a big chart. And the chart would show how fossil fuels will become less and less important over the coming decades. But it will still be there. It will still be important. And so what we have to figure out is how to work together. We can talk, we can fight, but if we work together, we can make a difference.
So I guess the message is you can't make the change without bringing the business community over to the table.
I think we need the business community at the table.
You also mentioned the importance of policy change as well. And I know you did a stint in government. You didn't think that it worked fast enough, and perhaps it does not, but that policy change is powerful. So with that in mind, I'm wondering, I know you're teaching business students, but do you have advice for viewers who want to work within the system for change, and even young people considering government service? Because boy, government service doesn't have the best reputation these days, but policy is important, you said.
I learned a really important lesson back in my Porto Novelli days. Our first big client was the National High Blood Pressure Education Program. And I was a refugee from commercial marketing, and I was applying my marketing principles to high blood pressure behavior change. And the idea in marketing basically is to work on the consumer, work on the target audience. And what I came to realize was that that's not enough. We have to also work on normative change, on social norms and expectations. And if we can do that, we can actually change individual behavior faster. And that was a lesson I've never forgotten. I've applied it when I was at AARP, tobacco, you name it. And so we really have to understand that we have to create change at two levels. At the big level of social norms, and that really requires policy and media and technology, but policy first. And then we have to work on individuals and families at the community level. If we can do those things together, we can make change.
Do you have hope for getting policy changes through with the divided Congress that we have, even with the new administration that seems to want to advance some of these things like climate change?
Well, I'm encouraged, but I am not unrealistic. And as I said before, we've got to realize we're in a cyclical down period. We've got to take it upon ourselves to do something. There are people who are in Congress today and in state government today who are willing to cross the aisle. I give an example in the book of two of my favorites. One is Olympia Snowe, a Republican senator who was afraid of nothing. She would cross the aisle to try to get something done. Another one was a Republican, Bill Frist. And when he was a Senate majority leader, he excelled at this. And what we need to do, I think, is to give these people encouragement and help them so that they don't get destroyed for making bipartisan choices.
Which is happening to those who try
Which
to.
is happening, yes.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit also about, you mentioned AARP. That was a big chapter in your life. You called them a warrior brand. Do you want to explain what you meant by that?
Well, I talk a lot in the book about partnerships. We've talked about it here. And AARP is always seeking partnerships, the kind that can create social change, but also commercial partners, because they endorse products and services, and that's how they earn the money to put into social change. But of course, at the same time, we were up on the hill fighting these battles. Companies have to think twice before they want to get involved with an organization that's out there fighting the good fight. So I would say to a company, we're a warrior brand. We're going to go out there and we're going to fight for policy change. So you have to think twice. Do you want to partner with us? Because if you do, what you see is what you get. And more often than not, companies would say, we do want to buy in. We do want to be part of this. In fact, we want to be part of the social side as well as the commercial side.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about what you did at AARP, sort of rebranding it, and also the big fight to get prescription drug coverage in Medicare?
Yeah, that was probably the biggest fight in my AARP career. So this was back when there was no prescription drug coverage in Medicare. So think about that today. You can't practice modern medicine without prescription drugs. And years after it happened, a Harvard study showed that it keeps people out of hospitals, out of nursing homes, out of other institutions. It enables older people to work. It was really powerful. But at the time, there was no prescription drugs in Medicare. And so we decided that we were going to make this our big cause. And we took it on. And I must say, if I could do it over again, I could do it better. But we won the day. We won the day. The Republicans were trying to get this done because they thought it would solidify the older vote. And the Democrats didn't like it because they didn't want the Republicans to have a Medicare win. So no matter what we did, we were coming up against opposition of some kind or other. But we got it done. And people say today that AARP brought that over the top. And one of the lessons from that, really, Deborah, was, you've got to understand what your constituents want. So, for example, there was a thing in the Medicare bill called the donut hole, which I won't go into now. It's a bit complicated. And what we found out was that our constituents didn't want that donut hole. They disliked it. And then you've got to try to inform them and educate them. And that didn't work either. The donut hole was not popular. But at the end of the day, you have to make a decision. You have to have the courage of your convictions. You have to do what you think is right for yourself, your organization, your country. And that's what we did. And that's why I'm so proud of that endeavor. But then, of course, we went on to oppose the Republicans on a bill that the Democrats favored. And so, turnabout is fair play.
What you said you would have done something differently? Do you want to talk about that?
Well, you're a media expert, you're a communicator, and you know that talking to the media is an art. And one of the things I did back then, even though I should have known better, was talk to the media too much. If I had it to do over again, I wouldn't have been so visible. I would have been less visible. I would have done a better job. I would have taken my own advice.
Well, that actually brings me to a question that I want to ask on behalf of many beleaguered communications professionals. Very often in an organization, the communications staff or leadership doesn't have the same seat at the executive table. It's kind of like, well, let's make all these decisions, and as an afterthought, go write a press release or whatever. And so I'm wondering, and I think we all agree, communications contribute enormously. You can't do without them in business and social change. What advice would you give to the people who are still trying to push that, ball up the hill in their organizations to show the value and the ROI of communications?
Well, I would even go farther than you just did. First of all, I think it's really foolish of an organization not to have the communications people, the chief communications officer, whomever, at the table. The days are gone, I think, when you could invent a product or a service and then call the communications people in, as you say, and tell the world about it. I mean, communications has to be part of creating the offering in the first place. That's just sound business and management decision making. But I would go beyond that. I think communications is a good ladder, a good stepping stone to the top. Today you'll see many corporate people who come up through legal, who come up through different aspects of a company. I say communications is a good stepping stone to the top of an organization. If you can communicate really well, you can make real differences.
I would love to believe that is true. It always seems like someone with the management, the MBA, the legal background, as you said, is deemed to be far more qualified than the person with the communication skills.
Well, a lot of my Georgetown students are MBA students, many of them, and many of them really understand the power of communications. I mean, I teach that and I stress it, and they get it.
I want to talk about your students in a minute, but one of the things that people in communications kind of have been charged with these days or have to deal with is, and this question came in from our audience, how do we win the public relations fight with the tribalization of information sources? The fact that many people are only getting their information from sources they agree with. So how do we try to present them with more, information and open their hearts and minds?
Well, I'm going to say, like everybody else, I don't know. It's just a really hard thing. I think we have to go back to policy. So let's look, for example, at the social media today. Um, you know, I don't think we can have a situation where Twitter or Facebook or somebody is determining what is reasonable communication. I think we need policy that oversees all that. And getting people to look at information that's not their everyday diet is really, really hard to do. This is one of the reasons why my family members disagree on policy. They disagree on where the country is going. So I really don't know the answer. Uh, I really think that policy is the answer. But many of our policymakers don't understand social media. When you listen to the kind of questions they ask people who are testifying, you realize that we need an education for policymakers.
Yeah, and so it sounds like you're saying that the social media company should be regulated.
We need to regulate how they determine, who can use their accounts, who can use their platforms. It's not enough to have them regulate themselves. It's like everything else. We need a really good balance between giving the private sector opportunities to excel and regulating them to protect the public.
Do we even have the structure, the government organization to try to do something like that?
Well, I think we have the government agencies, we have the government departments, but it doesn't seem to me that we're working this way in terms of synergy. I don't think so. It's not a coherent process.
Here's a somewhat related question. What is your view of the role of data analytics and artificial intelligence in public relations and marketing?
Well, I'm afraid that's a little bit beyond me. I just had a faculty committee meeting this morning, and the dean of our Georgetown Business School said data analytics is the future. And one of his pillars is artificial intelligence and the future of work. And so we're all looking at that very closely. And I think that he's probably right. It is the future of business. But in my view, and again, this is perhaps an old timer's view, I don't think anything will take the place of really good strategy. So many of these social media platforms, the other day I was on a call with a big nonprofit, and one of the directors of the nonprofit said, "The answer to the future is digital." And I said, "Yes, digital is important, but let's start with strategy."
The shiny new tools, although it's not so shiny anymore.
Any new object.
We're getting a lot of questions that are sort of related to this area. This one says, you were an early influence in my career, dating back to when you were a guest speaker in Kathy Jamison's political communications classes. Thank you for the inspiration. Back in the day, there were just a few broadcast national news outlets and many more respected nationally recognized newspapers. Today, the news media has blown up in a million pieces. How do you then get the message out to target audiences when the communication channels are so widely scattered?
Well, first I want to say to that questioner that Kathleen Jamison is alive and well today. And as the questioner probably knows, she heads the Annenberg Public Policy Center, and she did a blurb for Good Business for the book. And she did teach political communication. And, that's one of the ways I learned from listening to Kathleen. As far as media fragmentation goes, it is so different from our day, from the old days. The old idea of a news cycle is long gone. The news cycle is 24 hours, 7 days a week. We know that.
Right.
But I think it gives us opportunities. In those days, if you get turned down by one of the major media, you weren't going to get your story out. But today, there are many more ways and many more opportunities to tell the story. Of course, we still want to influence the Wall Street Journal. We still want to influence the major networks. But I think today we have a bigger landscape, a bigger mosaic on which to play.
I just want to remind people, if you want to submit a question, it's an email to headliners@press.org, headliners@press.org. Let's talk a little bit about, because we're sort of segueing into your work teaching the business leaders of tomorrow. Do you really think, you mentioned that students are more interested in, a purpose. And I'm wondering, is that really something very different? Or is it just, the times have changed, and what do you think they're really different? That we have more sort of hope for the business leaders of tomorrow?
Back in my day, when I started at Unilever. And the word entrepreneur never passed the classroom door. Nobody ever talked about that. I took a lot of marketing courses in the Wharton School at Penn. And the idea was join a big company, climb the ladder, get to the top, and that's the way it was. And it took me a long time to figure out that making significant contributions to solving major social problems was my career goal. It was a purpose goal. And even though there were people back then who thought that way, and I learned to think that way, I think it's much different today. These students, they say, I've got student debt. I want to have a family. I want to buy a nice house. I want to do well, but I do not want to lose my sense of purpose. And Deborah, they often talk about wanting a purpose as well as a paycheck. So I think it's much more prominent today. And the beauty of it is that companies are figuring it out. And they know that this young talent is so expensive to recruit and to keep. And in order to do that, they need to be responsive. So I do think it's different, and I think it's better.
What do you tell them that it will take for them to be successful?
Well, the same thing it took for you and for me back then. Although, we're of different generations, I think we had the same idea. So today, a lot of people say to me, the millennials, the Gen Z people, they're not like we were. They don't have the same appetite for work. Well, I think they're misunderstood. What I see is that they do want to work. They do want to do well. They are willing to put in the work, but they see it differently. They say to themselves, work is a thing. It's not a place. I'll do the work. I'll get it done. And they do. And so that appetite for hard work is something that I think they do have. And I think what we can tell them basically is what you were starting with way back at the beginning of this conversation. They need to work on leadership skills. They need to practice not just commitment, but competence. They need to be competent at whatever their trade is. It could be accounting, finance, marketing, communications, whatever it may be. They really need to get that. And if they do that, there'll be a place for them, and we'll make a difference.
Is there any element of ensuring that they realize the value of the human connection as opposed to just the digital connection?
Absolutely, absolutely. But I don't think they're the it's a digital age, and they're digital people. But I think they do get the human connection. I have to say that after every class, I have a song in my heart. I look at these young people and I say, and I'm not just talking about today's, I'm talking about the graduates of 2 and 3 and 4 years ago, because I stay in touch with them. They are the leaders of tomorrow. And I think they do understand the human side of the equation.
Yeah. Just a question, because I know there's a lot of disruption now in higher education, and some questions about what's the best way to go forward. You're in the MBA program, but you're there because you are a business leader who has practical experience, as opposed to someone who has been really just focused in academia. Do you see any sort of trend there of mixing that up, of giving students, more on the practical side? I'm just curious.
Well, I guess I have a bias there. I'm called a professor of the practice, and it's what you said. I'm not a tenured professor who's got to publish or perish. Students look at me and, these are students who have been out 5, 6, 7 years and they've come back for a degree. And they've been beat up in the real world. And they want some ROI. They don't want a bunch of fluff and puff. And so I think that benefits me and it benefits our relationship because I'm supposed to know something about the real world. And that's what they want. But I don't want to in any way denigrate tenured professors because the research they do is important. And if we can get the mix right, I think the students benefit.
Yeah, I wasn't meant to denigrate them, just wanted to know about the mix. Okay, here's a question. Do you ever work with U.S. public diplomacy efforts at the U.S. Information Agency or since? And how would you change those programs?
I have not done that, but I read about it quite a bit. And, I think I've seen this happen because I did a lot of work in the developing world. And I've seen how people in that part of the world regard America. And I think really, even though our star has lost some of its luster, we are seen as a beacon of democracy. And I think that that's very important as we strive to export democracy around the world. And information outreach is just critically important. It's just a part of our communication mix. And we've seen how that's taken a back seat and it's even been reduced lately. So I think whether we're communicating through Voice of America or the stations that reach Cuba, that reach all the different parts of the world, we need to get that right. And the way to make it right in my book is to make it objective.
So I assume you're pleased with some of the movement that's taken place in the last week or so over at those.
I really am. I really am. I think that again, we go back to communications. I think it's one of the most powerful tools we have.
Here is another question on a different topic. Reddit's battle with Wall Street is still fresh in our minds. And some on both sides of the political spectrum seem to think the little guy is getting cut off from making a buck at the expense of hedge funds. How do you see this issue?
That's the way I see that issue. I think that it goes back. It goes back to the housing mortgage bubble. It goes back to all kinds of things. Young people today, and I think the average person kind of has this feeling that the things aren't fair out there. Capitalism isn't working as well as it used to. We've got to figure this out and we've got to do something about it. We recently did a study at Georgetown of millennials and Gen Z age people in a time of COVID. And that's basically how they felt. They felt that they weren't getting a fair shake, that things were working against them. It was especially true of women who had to drop out of the workforce because they didn't have adequate childcare. I think this is part of socioeconomic inequality. And if we don't do something about it, and that includes Wall Street, if we don't do something about it, it's going to work to our long-term disadvantage.
Are you encouraged by the sort of new emphasis, and let's hope it's real, on diversity and inclusion in the workplace?
I think it's real. I talk to a lot of corporate and nonprofit leaders, and I think it's real. I think and COVID, it kind of has a perverse positive relationship there, because these are people who are struggling, keeping their organizations together, protecting their people, serving their communities. And I think they see this, let's call it socioeconomic equity and equality, you call it racial justice, whatever we want to call it. And we see this in the health world as well, healthcare disparities. I think it's real. And the people I talk to are basically saying, What can we do? How can we make our organization better? And Deborah, they even go beyond that. They say, how can we make our country better? So I do think it's real.
That's encouraging. What you mentioned working with VF, and I'm just wondering, what other current projects are you, I mean, you're still working in the business world, advising companies. So you want to talk about some of the other things you've got on your plate?
Well, I'm working on a lot of different things. I mentioned climate change. We talked about tobacco. I'm really focused today on trying to advance science and technology. So I'm part of a group that is basically saying to the new administration, we need to expand our leadership in science and technology. We need to improve our coordination, and we need to increase our investment. And then one of my most heartfelt projects is, you mentioned it, the Coalition to Transform Advanced Care.
Mm-hmm.
I really care about this issue of advanced illness and end-of-life care. And you know, in the book, I talk about a story I got from a bunch of gerontologists. And the story was, they said, we should all live to a ripe old age, well into our 90s, and then have it all end with a quick bullet fired by a jealous lover. But we know that that's not how it ends. And so we've got to do something about advanced illness today. And as our population ages and more of them move into the healthcare system, it becomes even more important.
Your last chapter deals with what do we owe our grandchildren? And so what do we owe our grandchildren?
Well, we owe them a great deal. And the reason we owe them so much is because we were given so much. We were given a great country. And yes, it has its flaws, but we were given a great country. And our goal, our job, our legacy is to make it better and to pass it on. That goes for the American dream, which is a bit tattered right now and torn, but we owe them all that and more. I have 7 grandchildren, and I'm very proud of that. And I say to myself, all 4 of my grandparents came to this country as immigrants. And when I grew up, I thought, what are the immigrant values? And those values are love of country, love of the United States, love of family, a reverence for education, an appetite for hard work, all those things. And how can we pass that on to our grandchildren? They have so much more than we had when we were kids. But if we can give them the country they deserve, we will have done our jobs.
Well, you've given us lots of good thoughts on how to do that. We have a couple more questions I'm going to try to get in as we're closing in on our witching hour here. Do you address the peso concept in your book, paid, earned, shared, owned? It seems to be a more common way of thinking about a way of segmenting all the marketing channels at a brand's disposal into concrete groups. Is earned PR as important, or is it overshadowed now by shared and owned?
Well, I don't pretend to be as current as that person with this issue, but I call we can call it earned. I think it's very, very important. It's an art, as we know, but I really truly believe that that earned media is as important as it ever was.
So not overshadowed by shared and owned.
I don't think so.
Okay. With all of another question, with all of the disruption caused by the pandemic, what do you see as the future of higher education? Is student debt relief justified or not? And what can be done to bring down the escalating costs?
Wow. Well, that's going to take us another hour. I'm going to get a little controversial here. I think the model is broken. We can't keep increasing tuition 3, 4, 5% a year and make it affordable to American families. And, many people today are questioning the value of higher education. I happen to think that the value is there and that it's a very important thing. And obviously, I'm part of it. But we've got to basically figure out how to fix it. And, I've had parents say to me, why should I pay extra for that chemistry lab across the campus? My daughter's majoring in finance. We've got to figure out how to make the value seen and the value be fair. And we don't have it figured out right now. We've got to work on that.
Do you see any evidence of leaders in higher education coming together to work on that rather than being more insularly focused on their own institutions?
Oh, I do think they're coming together. The president of Georgetown, Jack DeGioia, is somebody who questions this all the time. The dean of our business school is asking these questions all the time. What is fair value and how do you achieve it?
So we've covered a lot of different topics that are touched on in your book. When you wrote the book, do you think to yourself, if there's one thing I want to make sure people take away, one big message that they should take to heart, what would that be?
Well, you've touched on them, and I think some of our questions touched on them as well. The idea that we can all make a difference, that companies are moving towards doing well by doing good, that we owe our grandchildren a great deal. But one thing we didn't touch on that I'd like to mention is the importance of teams. So in the book, one of the points I make is I've never done anything. I've never succeeded in anything by myself. It's always been great teams. And one of the things I used to say at AARP when I'd go home every night is about 100 decisions got made today that influence the future of this organization. And I made maybe 5 of them. So who made the other 95? And the answer is teams, people who basically make decisions and it cascades downward. And we've got to basically think about how we nurture great teams. And one of the important things, I think, Deborah, is whenever you put a team together, you got to leave your ego at the door. And you got to basically say, I want my teammates to tell me what's wrong with my ideas. And if we can do that, if we can nurture great teams, I think we can move mountains.
Do you have any advice for those who may work with a leader who doesn't quite see it that way?
Well, I have 2 pieces of advice, and I tell this to my students. Number 1, don't work for somebody you don't respect. Life is too short. It should be somebody who cares about you, who wants to nurture you, who wants to coach you and teach you. I think that's very, very important. So when you're looking at a job, interview the person interviewing you and make sure that it's going to work for you. And number 2, and I learned this the hard way, we can all learn from negative leaders. One of the best marketing people I ever met in my life was a tough guy, almost a nasty guy. And he made life difficult for me, but boy, did I learn marketing.
Are there some questions then that you recommend that as your students are going out to, look for employment, that they ask of the companies?
Well, again, who am I going to work for? I don't think it's too much. First of all, you better do your homework and learn everything you can about that company. But who am I going to work for? Make sure that they have a sense of mission and purpose. A lot of companies do, and a lot of companies don't. And you want to make sure that you can make a difference. CVS Health is an example. So a colleague of mine, her name is Eileen Boone. She runs the corporate social responsibility part of CVS Health. And she says, the HR people love me because people come to CVS Health, pharmacists, truck drivers, you name it, because we have a purpose. So make sure that purpose is there.
I do have a final question, and I don't see any, unless my email's slow, any other questions coming in from the audience. Before I ask it, I just want to say a few thank yous to our producer, Lindsay Underwood, to the co-chairs of the Headliners Committee, Dinah Leinwan-Leger and Lori Russo, to the head of the communicators team, Danny Selnick, the great team at the National Press Club's Broadcast Center. I have to say the Press Club staff has been doing just incredible work during this COVID shutdown to make all of these virtual events successful and possible until we can all meet in person again. So, last question, Bill. It seems that the joy of work is what keeps you going. I'm sure there's a fair amount of exercise that goes into it too. But there was a question in the book that just really intrigued me, and I was wondering what your answer to it is. And it was, how old would you be if you didn't know how old you are, and why?
Yeah, that's one of the greatest questions of all time. It was asked by the great Negro Leagues and Major League pitcher Satchel Paige. How old would you be if you didn't know how old you are? And you know, Deborah, there are 50-year-olds who are sitting on their porch rocking away, and there are 90-year-olds who are climbing mountains. And the answer is, you're only as old as you feel. And as we used to say, age is just a number. I mean, it's what you make it. And that's exactly how I feel. And so that's why my favorite question is, what's next?
That's my next follow-up on that. What's next?
Well, for me, what's next is I have a lot of things I'm working on. I'm enjoying my students. And I just want to say one more thing. I really am impressed and have always been so with the National Press Club. And I want to show Danny my Press Club mug right here. Thank you so much for having me.
I think Danny's going to love that. Well, we really appreciate your sharing your thoughts with us. I know you're not going to be able to go out on the book signing circuit anytime soon, but at least through these virtual events, we can help talk about the messages in your book and hopefully move forward into a better era of good business.
Yeah.
So, thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Deborah. Stay well.
Thanks to everyone who tuned in today.